Open the safe and 100 million is yours, the billionaire quipped. But little did he know, this seemingly impossible challenge would be met head-on by an unlikely contender. Before we delve further, let us know in the comments where you're tuning in from. Tension hung heavy in the air on the 42nd floor of the Chrysler Building as Farid Alza fixed his gaze upon the unyielding steel door of his private vault. For 3 relentless hours, his hand-picked team of the world's foremost security specialists had exhausted every avenue, advanced algorithms, thermal imaging, even a direct line to the Swiss manufacturer. Yet, their efforts were futile. The electronic lock remained stubbornly sealed, guarding millions of dollars and crucial business documents. Farid desperately needed to finalize a merger agreement with a rapidly approaching deadline, a mere 2 hours away. "Sir, we've depleted all conventional strategies," Marcus, the head technician, declared, wiping beads of perspiration from his brow despite the chilled air conditioning. His team, 5 experts clad in impeccably tailored suits, wore expressions of defeat, their sophisticated equipment strewn across the marble floor like nothing more than extravagant paperweights. Farid Alza, the heir to one of the Middle East's most substantial oil fortunes and the proprietor of a business empire spanning 3 continents, had rarely felt so utterly helpless. At 38, he commanded respect in boardrooms stretching from Dubai to Wall Street. Yet, here he was, stymied by a simple electronic lock, made to look foolish in the presence of his own staff. The irony was almost unbearable. A man with the power to acquire entire city blocks rendered powerless to access his own wealth. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, the vibrant pulse of Manhattan throbbed. Far below, nestled in the shadows cast by towering skyscrapers, existed another reality, a world of struggle, poverty, and abandoned aspirations. Instead of attacking the main control panel that had frustrated the experts, she focused on seemingly unrelated components: the ventilation sensors, the battery backup indicators, the temperature monitoring system. "What are you doing?" Marcus couldn't resist asking, his professional curiosity overriding his instructions to remain silent. "Creating a controlled emergency," Harper replied without looking up. "The safe's programming has hierarchical priorities. Security is priority 1, but system preservation is priority 0, the foundational directive that overrides everything else." Her fingers located a small auxiliary panel that the technicians had dismissed as inconsequential. With precise movements, she began to manipulate settings that controlled the safe's internal environment. Temperature readings began to fluctuate, humidity sensors registered anomalous data, and the safe's internal diagnostics started detecting what appeared to be environmental threats to its delicate electronic components. "You're tricking it into thinking it's in danger," Farid realized, his business acumen recognizing the elegance of the strategy. "But won't that trigger additional security lockdowns?" "Only if the threat appears to be external," Harper explained, her concentration unwavering. "But if the threat seems to be internal system failure, the emergency protocols prioritize preserving data integrity over maintaining security. The safe would rather risk unauthorized access than lose the data it's supposed to protect." The logic was brilliant in its simplicity. Instead of attempting to breach the safe's defenses, Harper was persuading it to voluntarily lower those defenses. She was communicating with the system in its own language, exploiting programming assumptions that the designers had never anticipated a 10-year-old could understand. Warning lights began to flash on the main display. Someone who understands systems from the bottom up, who has experienced firsthand what happens when those systems fail people, someone who has the intelligence to design better solutions, and now the resources to implement them. Harper was quiet for a long moment, her young mind processing implications that reached far beyond her personal circumstances. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a maturity that seemed to transform the air in the room. "If I accept this, I won't just be helping myself. I'll be responsible for using this opportunity to help other people like me, kids who are forgotten, ignored, written off by systems that don't see their potential." "I would expect nothing less," Farid replied. The conversation had evolved into something neither of them had anticipated. What had begun as a gesture about payment for services rendered was becoming a dialogue about social responsibility, systemic change, and the obligation that comes with unexpected opportunity. Harper looked around the luxurious office, taking in the artwork that cost more than most people earned in a lifetime, the furniture that represented casual wealth beyond her previous imagination, the view of a city that contained both unprecedented luxury and devastating poverty. "I'll need help," she said finally. "I know how to survive, and apparently I know how to solve technical problems, but I don't know how to manage the kind of resources you're talking about." "That can be arranged," Faird assured her. "Financial advisors, legal counsel, educational opportunities, whatever you need to transform potential into lasting impact. And you'll expect nothing in return? No control over how I use the money? No influence over the decisions I make?" Faird smiled, recognizing in her questions the same strategic thinking that had made him successful in business. "I'll expect you to use your gifts wisely. Beyond that, the choices are yours to make." "Ladies and gentlemen," Harper began, her voice carrying the confidence of someone who had learned to command attention through substance rather than credentials. "I want to tell you about Maria Rodriguez, who developed a water purification system using materials from a junkyard because her family couldn't afford clean drinking water, about James Chun, who created an app that helps homeless individuals find safe sleeping locations and available resources because he spent 3 years living on the streets after aging out of foster care, about Aisha Williams, who designed a more efficient food distribution system for her neighborhood food bank because she understood hunger in ways that textbooks never teach. The audience was silent, captivated by stories that challenged every assumption they held about where intelligence originated and how it manifested. These young people weren't discovered through traditional academic screening or standardized testing. They were found because we looked in places where others saw only problems, and we recognized solutions where others saw only obstacles. In the front row, Faird watched with pride as the homeless child he had met in his office commanded the attention of some of the most educated people in America. The foundation had become everything they had envisioned and more, a systematic challenge to institutional bias that was producing measurable results. "But tonight, I want to address a more fundamental question," Harper continued. "What happens when society consistently fails to recognize intelligence because it appears in unexpected forms or inconvenient circumstances?" She clicked to a slide showing statistics that had shocked even her. The number of children with extraordinary abilities who never received opportunities to develop them, the correlation between economic circumstances and educational access, and the systemic barriers that prevented unconventional intelligence from being recognized. It was a world Reed rarely acknowledged, shielded as he was by chauffeured luxury cars, private elevators, and security teams meticulously trained to ensure he remained untouched by the harsh realities of American inequality. But today, these two disparate worlds were on a collision course, about to intersect in the most unforeseen manner. A small figure was already navigating the building's service corridors, propelled by a desperate hunger and carrying an unexpected gift that would alter both of their destinies forever. Harper Martinez had been eking out a living on the unforgiving streets of New York for the past 8 months, ever since the foster care system had failed her, not once, not twice, but for the third heart-wrenching time. At the tender age of 10, she had acquired a streetwise cunning that belied her age, allowing her to navigate the city's hidden underbelly with surprising ease. Her diminutive stature and innocent appearance were both a blessing and a curse, rendering her invisible to some while making her a target for others seeking to exploit her vulnerability. Today, the gnawing emptiness in her stomach was particularly acute. She hadn't had a proper meal in 2 days, surviving solely on water sourced from public fountains and the occasional act of kindness from strangers. The biting December wind whipped through her thin jacket as she surveyed the imposing Chrysler building from across the street. She had learned that office buildings often discarded perfectly good food, and that the higher the floor, the more lavish the leftovers from executive catering were likely to be. Employing skills honed by observing and interacting with other street kids, Harper slipped through a service entrance during a shift change, moving like a shadow through the labyrinthine service corridors, her bare feet silent against the cold concrete. New error messages appeared, not the repetitive authentication failures the technicians had been battling, but urgent alerts concerning environmental conditions and system stability. The safe's internal processes shifted into emergency mode, running diagnostic subroutines that hadn't been activated since its initial installation. "This is either genius or complete disaster," Marcus whispered to Dr. Chin. "Both," Chin replied, his voice a mixture of admiration and terror. "If she's right, we're about to witness the most unconventional safe cracking in history. If she's wrong." Harper's hands moved faster now, making minute adjustments to multiple systems simultaneously. She was orchestrating a symphony of controlled chaos, each element carefully calculated to push the safe's programming toward the tipping point where security protocols would yield to preservation instincts. The temperature readings spiked. Humidity sensors blared warnings. Power consumption indicators exhibited dangerous fluctuations, suggesting imminent hardware failure. To the safe's artificial intelligence, it appeared that catastrophic system failure was imminent, the kind of failure that could obliterate not only the locking mechanisms, but also the precious data stored within. "Now comes the critical moment," Harper murmured, her small hands hovering over a series of controls. "I need to convince the system that the only way to preserve data integrity is to unlock and allow manual extraction of contents before complete system failure occurs." She began entering a complex sequence of commands, not into the main control panel, but into the environmental management system. Each keystroke was deliberate, building toward a conclusion that existed only in her remarkably gifted mind. The safe's behavior began to change. The rhythmic cycling of error codes became erratic. Warning alarms that had been silent throughout the 3 hours of expert attempts suddenly began to sound. Harper walked slowly toward the open safe, her bare feet silent on the plush carpet as she approached the vault that had just changed the trajectory of her life. The adults watched her with a mixture of fascination and respect, recognizing that they were witnessing something historic, not just the solution to a technical problem, but the emergence of a force that could reshape the very foundations of how society recognized and nurtured human potential. "Before I give you my answer," she said, her small hand resting on the safe steel door, "I need you to understand what your offer really means, not just to me, but to everyone like me." She turned back to face the room, her blue eyes moving from person to person as she spoke. "There are thousands of kids living on the streets right now, kids with gifts that nobody recognizes because they're too busy surviving to demonstrate them in ways that matter to the people with power. Kids who could solve problems you haven't even thought of yet if they just had the chance." Dr. Chin found himself leaning forward, captivated by the depth of her perspective. "You're talking about systemic change, not just individual success." "Exactly. One person escaping poverty is a feel-good story. One person using their escape to create pathways for others, that's revolution." Harper's voice carried conviction that seemed impossible for someone her age. "Your $100 million doesn't just buy my freedom. It buys the responsibility to prove that intelligence exists everywhere, not just in places where people expect to find it." Marcus, who had spent the morning frustrated by his inability to solve a problem this child had cracked in minutes, spoke up. "What would you do specifically? I mean, how would you use resources like that to create the kind of change you're talking about?" Harper's response revealed that she had been thinking about these questions long before she had ever imagined having the resources to address them. "We lose innovations that could solve our greatest challenges. We waste human potential on a scale that should be considered a national emergency. We perpetuate systems that mistake privilege for ability and conformity for intelligence." The audience shifted uncomfortably. Harper had learned to read rooms during her months of advocacy, and she could see that her words were hitting their intended target, the comfortable assumptions that allowed educational inequality to persist. The Harper Foundation has proven that intelligence exists everywhere, not just in places where we expect to find it. Our young innovators have developed solutions to problems that traditional institutions have struggled with for decades, precisely because their experiences gave them perspectives that conventional education never could. She paused, allowing the implications to sink in before delivering the challenge she had come here to present. "So, here's my question for all of you. Are you ready to change how your institutions operate? Are you prepared to look for intelligence in places where it's been invisible? Are you willing to admit that some of your traditional gatekeeping methods have been blocking exactly the kind of innovative thinking our society needs most? The silence in the auditorium was profound. Harper had just asked some of the most powerful people in education to acknowledge that their systems had fundamental flaws and to take responsibility for changing them. Because if you are, she continued, the Harper Foundation is ready to partner with you. We'll help you identify overlooked talent in your communities. We'll share the assessment methods we've developed for recognizing non-traditional intelligence. We'll provide resources to support young people whose brilliance doesn't fit conventional molds. She looked directly at the camera recording her speech, knowing that her words would reach far beyond this auditorium. Years of navigating foster homes and the streets had taught her to read people, to sense impending danger, and, most importantly, to identify opportunities where others saw only insurmountable obstacles. The building security system was undoubtedly sophisticated, but it was primarily designed to deter adult intruders, not a resourceful child capable of squeezing into ventilation shafts and maneuvering through spaces inaccessible to larger individuals. Harper possessed an unusual aptitude for technology. Computers, phones, electronic devices of all kinds seemed to intuitively make sense to her, often astonishing the few adults who had taken the time to notice. In the fleeting moments she managed to spend at the public library, when she wasn't busy evading social workers, she would immerse herself in programming languages and delve into cybersecurity forums, devouring information with an insatiable hunger. As she ascended through the building's service areas, Harper detected the sound of raised voices emanating from an executive office. Overcoming her natural caution, she pressed her ear against a maintenance panel. Through the thin metal barrier, she could discern fragments of a frustrated conversation, catching snippets of words like encrypted, security breach, and deadline. Her empty stomach growled in protest, reminding her of her initial objective. Perhaps these affluent executives would have leftover sandwiches from a business meeting. Maybe, just maybe, someone would take pity on a hungry child. It was a risk worth taking. With practiced stealth, Harper located an air vent that led directly into the executive office. She had executed this maneuver countless times before. Most adults were so engrossed in their own concerns that they rarely bothered to look up. She carefully removed the vent cover and lowered herself into what appeared to be the most opulent office she had ever laid eyes on. The room was a veritable shrine to wealth and influence. Emergency lighting activated inside the vault, visible through the small window in the door. Emergency data preservation mode, Harper announced with satisfaction. The system is now prioritizing content protection over access restriction. But even as she spoke, new challenges emerged. The safe's programming was more sophisticated than she had initially estimated. Emergency protocols were activating, but they were triggering additional security measures she hadn't anticipated. Backup systems were coming online, redundant locks were engaging, and the entire system seemed to be preparing for a complete shutdown rather than an emergency unlock. It's fighting back, she realized, her confidence wavering for the first time. As the emergency protocols are more complex than I thought, there are multiple layers of programming conflicting with each other. Sweat beaded on her forehead despite the office's air conditioning. She had committed herself to a path that was rapidly becoming more complicated than she had envisioned. The watching adults could sense the subtle shift in her demeanor, the first hints of uncertainty creeping into her previously confident approach. Ferd checked his watch. 53 minutes until his deadline. His entire business empire hung in the balance, dependent on a homeless child who might have overestimated her capabilities. The irony was not lost on him. He commanded resources that could influence global markets, yet his fate now rested in the hands of someone society had utterly abandoned. "Can you still do this?" he asked quietly, his voice conveying genuine concern rather than pressure. Harper looked up at him, her young face reflecting a maturity forged from surviving in a world that had consistently underestimated her. "I don't know," she admitted honestly. "This is more complex than anything I've attempted before," but she turned back to the control panel. "I've never had anything worth $100 million depending on my success, either. Education first, but not traditional education. The current system failed me and fails thousands of others every year. We need learning environments that recognize different types of intelligence, different ways of processing information, different life experiences that can contribute to problem solving. She began to pace, her mind clearly racing as she articulated ideas that had been forming throughout her difficult experiences. Second, we need to change how society identifies potential. Right now, we look for intelligence in people who already have advantages, good schools, stable families, economic security. But what about the kid who figures out how to hack free internet because she can't afford it? Or the one who develops survival strategies that would impress military tacticians? That's intelligence, too. It's just not the kind that shows up on standardized tests. Ferd watched her with growing admiration. This wasn't just a bright child with technical skills. This was a visionary who understood systems thinking at a level that most graduate students never achieved. Third, Harper continued, we need to create pathways that don't require people to abandon their communities to succeed. Most programs for gifted kids from disadvantaged backgrounds essentially say, prove you can fit into our world. What if instead we said, show us how your world has taught you things ours never could? The room was completely silent, except for the distant hum of Manhattan traffic. Even the safe's electronic systems had reset to their normal, quiet operation. Harper's words were reshaping how everyone present thought about intelligence, opportunity, and social responsibility. You've thought about this a lot, Ferd observed. I've lived it. Every day on the streets is a masterclass in resource optimization, risk assessment, and creative problem solving. But none of that matters to people who make decisions about who gets opportunities and who doesn't. And if you're not ready for that level of change, then you need to ask yourself a different question. How many more innovations will we lose? How many more brilliant minds will we waste before we finally admit that intelligence isn't a rare commodity confined to privileged circumstances? It's a human capacity that flourishes everywhere, waiting only for recognition and opportunity. The standing ovation that followed lasted 7 minutes. 2 years later, Harper stood in the rebuilt community center in Detroit's Corktown neighborhood, watching 12-year-old Marcus demonstrate the urban farming system he had designed using recycled materials and solar panels salvaged from abandoned buildings. Around them, 43 young innovators from the Harper Foundation's expanded program were showcasing solutions to problems that ranged from affordable housing design to sustainable energy distribution. Ferd arrived for the quarterly foundation review, but these visits had evolved far beyond simple oversight. He came to witness what systematic change looked like when intelligence was recognized and nurtured, regardless of its origins. The foundation now operated in 15 cities, had identified over 2,000 young innovators, and had influenced policy changes in educational institutions across 3 countries. Any regrets? He asked Harper as they watched a 14-year-old former foster child explain her water conservation invention to a group of visiting engineers. Harper smiled, the same analytical expression she had worn when facing his locked safe, but now tempered with the satisfaction of someone whose vision had become reality. Only that it took so long to get started. The numbers told an extraordinary story. Foundation participants had filed 127 patents, started 34 successful businesses, and developed solutions to infrastructure problems that had stumped traditional institutions. Original works of art adorned the walls. The plush carpet was so dense that she sank into it, and the furniture looked as if it belonged in a royal palace. But what immediately captivated her attention was the cluster of impeccably dressed men huddled around a massive steel safe, their expensive equipment scattered haphazardly, like discarded toys that had ceased to function. Harper's analytical mind swiftly assessed the situation. The men were clearly grappling with some kind of sophisticated electronic lock system. She observed LED displays, circuit boards, and diagnostic tools, all elements that she instinctively understood, despite lacking any formal training. Years spent tinkering with discarded electronics in dumpsters behind computer repair shops had provided her with an almost intuitive grasp of how these systems operated. The man at the center of the group appeared to be the one in charge. His tailored suit likely cost more than most people earned in a year, and his bearing exuded the type of authority that stemmed from never having been told no. This had to be Ferd al-Zahara, whose name she had encountered on building directories and in news articles during her research sessions at the library. For a fleeting moment, Harper hesitated. She could easily retreat back into the vent unnoticed, but the pangs of hunger were overwhelming, and something about the challenge presented by that electronic safe sparked her brilliant mind's curiosity. Disregarding her better judgment, she stepped forward into the light. The room fell into stunned silence as Harper emerged from behind the enormous mahogany desk. 6 pairs of eyes swiveled in her direction, registering utter disbelief. 5 security technicians in expensive suits, and 1 billionaire who looked as though he had just seen a ghost. "Security breach," Marcus exclaimed, instinctively reaching for his radio. How did a child bypass security? Wait. The admission hung in the air between them, part confidence, part confession, entirely human. She was just a child after all, despite her extraordinary abilities, a child who was hungry, alone, and carrying burdens that number 10-year-old should have to bear. But she was also something more, someone who had learned to find solutions where others saw only obstacles, someone who had survived by being smarter and more resourceful than the system that had failed her. And now, for the first time in her short, difficult life, her unique gifts might actually be rewarded instead of ignored. The safe's electronic systems were now in full emergency mode, creating a cacophony of warning sounds and flashing lights that transformed Faird's elegant office into something resembling a space mission control center. During a crisis, Harper stood before the chaotic scene, her small frame seemingly swallowed by the enormous vault. Yet, her mind was operating at a level that astonished even the most seasoned experts observing her. "The problem is architectural," she declared, her voice cutting through the electronic cacophony. The designers of the safe had anticipated the possibility of someone attempting to trigger emergency protocols, so they incorporated conflict resolution systems. When emergency preservation mode is activated, it simultaneously initiates enhanced security protocols as a countermeasure. Dr. Chen moved closer, his earlier skepticism now completely replaced by professional fascination. "So, the system is essentially fighting itself." "Exactly. Imagine 2 different parts of your brain issuing contradictory commands at the same time," Harper explained. Her explanation was simple enough for everyone to grasp, despite the complex technical concepts involved. The security subsystem is screaming, "Lock everything down," while the preservation subsystem is shouting, "Protect the data at all costs." The safe is paralyzed by its own conflicting directives. Harper's voice carried no bitterness, just the matter-of-fact assessment of someone who had learned to navigate systemic bias. "Until now," Dr. Chen said quietly. "Maybe, if I'm smart enough to use this opportunity correctly." Harper looked directly at Faird. "That's why I need to know what you really expect, because once I accept this money, I'm not just responsible to myself anymore. I'm responsible to every kid who's ever been overlooked, underestimated, or written off." Faird stood and walked to his desk, pulling out a legal pad and pen. "What if we make this formal? Not just a promise, but a contract that protects both your independence and your commitment to the principles you're describing." "What kind of contract?" "One that transfers the money to you with no strings attached, but also establishes a foundation dedicated to identifying and nurturing intelligence wherever it appears. You would control the foundation, determine its priorities, and have complete authority over its operations." Harper studied his face carefully. "And your role would be advisory if you want it, financial if you need it, but not controlling. The decisions would be yours to make." For the first time since opening the safe, Harper showed signs of her actual age. The weight of the conversation, the magnitude of the opportunity, and the pressure of representing so many others like herself were clearly overwhelming her young mind. "This is scary," she admitted quietly. "A few hours ago, I was just trying to find something to eat. Now you're talking about changing how society works." Marcus stepped forward, his earlier frustration replaced by genuine respect. "Maybe that's exactly why you're the right person for this responsibility, someone who remembers what it's like to be invisible, to be dismissed, to have potential that nobody recognizes. And someone," Dr. Chen added, "who has demonstrated that unconventional approaches can solve problems that traditional methods can't touch." But more importantly, they had proven that intelligence wasn't a rare commodity. It was a human capacity that flourished when given proper recognition and support. The real success, Harper reflected, isn't just what these kids have accomplished, it's that we've changed how people look for intelligence. School districts are revising their identification methods. Foster care systems are implementing new assessment tools. Even juvenile detention centers are recognizing that behavioral problems sometimes mask extraordinary analytical abilities. As the afternoon demonstration concluded, Harper addressed the assembled crowd of young innovators, community leaders, and visiting officials. 2 years ago, most of you were invisible to systems designed to identify and develop talent. Today, you're proving that brilliance exists everywhere. It just needed to be recognized and supported. She paused, looking around the room at faces that reflected every background and circumstance America contained. You've shown the world that intelligence isn't about where you come from or what advantages you've had. It's about how you think, how you solve problems, and how you use your abilities to make things better for others. The Harper Foundation had become more than a philanthropic organization. It had become proof that social transformation was possible when you changed the fundamental assumptions about human potential. Intelligence, it turned out, had always been everywhere. Society had finally learned how to see it. Harper Martinez changed the world because one person saw potential where others saw only poverty. Right now, in your community, there's another Harper. A brilliant child whose intelligence is invisible to the systems designed to find it, a young mind that could solve problems you haven't even imagined if someone just gave them the chance. The question isn't whether these kids exist. The question is whether you'll be the one to recognize them. Ferd commanded, raising a hand to forestall further action, his dark eyes scrutinizing the small intruder with a mixture of astonishment and annoyance. "How did you get in here, child?" Harper's stomach emitted a loud growl, answering the question for her. She raised her gaze to meet the towering man's eyes, her blue eyes conveying not a trace of fear. Years of existing in a world that had consistently failed her had stripped away any intimidation she might have felt in the presence of wealth and power. "I'm hungry," she stated simply, her voice clear and unwavering despite her small size. "I was looking for food, but..." Her gaze drifted toward the open safe door and the complex electronic panel that had stumped the experts. "I can see you guys are having some computer problems." The technicians exchanged glances that ranged from amusement to insult. Marcus took a step forward, his voice dripping with condescension. "Little girl, this is a military-grade security system worth more than most people's houses. You should probably..." "It's a modular double guard with quantum encryption," Harper interjected, studying the LED display from across the room. "The problem isn't the lock mechanism. It's probably a cascading authentication failure in the biometric overlay. You're trying to force a manual override when you should be resetting the temporal sequencing." The room fell silent. Even Ferd, accustomed to being the most intelligent person in any given setting, found himself staring incredulously at this homeless child who had just diagnosed a problem his team of experts had been unable to solve. "That's actually a very astute observation," whispered Dr. Chin, the cybersecurity specialist who had been flown in from Silicon Valley specifically for this assignment. "But how could you possibly know about quantum encryption protocols?" Harper shrugged, her attention still riveted to the safe's display panel. "I read a lot. Library computers are free." Marcus stared at his expensive diagnostic equipment scattered across the marble floor, equipment that had failed to identify this fundamental design flaw. "So, what do we do? How do we resolve the conflict?" Harper's eyes remained fixed on the display, her mind racing through possibilities. Years of living on the streets had taught her that when two powerful forces are in conflict, the solution often lies not in choosing a side, but in finding a third option that satisfies both. "We don't resolve the conflict," she said slowly, a new idea taking shape. "We escalate it." The adults exchanged worried glances. Ferd's deadline was fast approaching, and the suggestion to exacerbate the situation rather than improve it seemed counterintuitive at best, dangerous at worst. "Explain," Ferd commanded, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to making billion-dollar decisions based on incomplete information. Harper's hands moved to a different section of the control panel, one that none of the technicians had paid attention to during their hours of failed attempts. "Every conflict resolution system has a breaking point, a level of contradiction that forces it to reset to factory defaults rather than continue operating in an inconsistent state. She began entering commands that seemed designed to worsen the safe's condition. Environmental readings became even more erratic. System diagnostics reported cascading failures across multiple subsystems. The conflict between security and preservation protocols intensified to a level that the safe's programming had never been designed to handle. "You're creating a logic bomb," Dr. Chen realized, his voice a mixture of admiration and horror, forcing the system into a state where it has no choice but to completely restart its decision-making process. "More than that," Harper replied, her concentration absolute. Harper was quiet for several minutes, her young mind processing implications that reached far beyond her personal circumstances. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady but thoughtful. "If I do this, I want to start with something small but important, a pilot program that identifies kids with non-traditional intelligence and gives them resources to develop their gifts without forcing them to abandon their communities or conform to traditional academic models." "How would you identify these kids?" Ferd asked, genuinely curious about her strategic thinking. "The same way you identified me, by looking in places where people don't expect to find intelligence. Homeless shelters, juvenile detention centers, foster care systems, inner-city schools that have been written off. And by recognizing different types of problem-solving skills, not just academic performance." She moved to the window, looking down at the Manhattan streets with new eyes, not as a place of survival and struggle, but as a landscape of untapped potential waiting to be discovered. "I want to prove that brilliance exists everywhere, not just in privileged environments. And I want to create pathways that celebrate different types of intelligence instead of trying to force everyone into the same mold." Ferd joined her at the window. "That's ambitious, revolutionary even. It has to be. Incremental change isn't enough when the fundamental assumptions are wrong." Harper's reflection in the glass showed someone far older than her 10 years, someone who had been transformed not just by opportunity, but by the recognition of her own power to create change. "So," she said, turning back to face the room, "let's talk about the details of this contract, because I think we're about to change some lives. Every day that passes, we lose innovations that could change everything. We waste potential that could transform communities. We overlook solutions to our biggest challenges because we're not looking in the right places. But you can change that." Share Harper's story. "When people understand that intelligence appears everywhere, they start seeing it everywhere. Look differently. The next time you encounter a young person from difficult circumstances, ask yourself, what if they learn to do that textbooks don't teach? Demand better. Push your local schools and community programs to recognize different types of brilliance, not just traditional academic success. Because somewhere in your city tonight, there's a child with the mind to unlock solutions we desperately need. They're waiting for someone to see them, someone to believe in them, someone like you. Don't let the next Harper remain invisible. Share this story now. And there are forums where people discuss this stuff." She paused, her stomach cramping again. "Look, give me some food, and I'll open your safe for you." The proposition hung in the air like an impossibility. Marcus was the first to laugh, a sharp burst of disbelief. "Sir, with all due respect, we should call child services and—" "Give me some food, and I'll open the safe for you," Harper repeated, her voice firmer this time. Ferd Alzera began to chuckle, a deep, resonant sound that reverberated throughout the enormous office. The notion was so absurd, so utterly preposterous, that he couldn't help himself. His 5-man team of experts, each earning more per hour than most people earned in a week, joined in the laughter. The sound echoed off the marble walls and the original Picasso paintings, creating a chorus of educated dismissal. But Harper didn't flinch. She had encountered this kind of laughter before, from foster parents who disbelieved her abilities, from teachers who couldn't fathom that a homeless child could grasp advanced mathematics, from social workers who saw only another damaged child instead of recognizing her extraordinary intellect. When the laughter subsided, Ferd wiped tears from his eyes. The stress of the morning, combined with the sheer absurdity of the situation, had pushed him close to the edge of hysteria. Here was a homeless child, likely no older than 10, asserting that she could resolve a problem that had defeated some of the world's leading security professionals. "All right, little genius," he said, his voice still laced with amusement. "If you can open that safe, if you can actually accomplish what these 5 men with their degrees and expensive equipment cannot, I'll give you $100 million. The staggering number lingered in the air like a challenge, a jest, a promise that everyone present knew was impossible to fulfill. $100 million to a homeless child who probably had never even seen $100 in her entire life. I'm creating a situation where maintaining current security protocols would guarantee the destruction of the data. The safe is designed to protect. When that happens, the preservation directive will override everything else, including the architectural safeguards against emergency access." The theory was elegant, but the execution incredibly risky. If Harper miscalculated, she could trigger a complete system shutdown that would lock the safe permanently, making it impossible to access the contents without physically destroying the vault, a process that would take days and likely damage the documents inside. Ferd watched the young girl work with a mixture of amazement and growing respect. He had built his fortune by recognizing talent wherever it appeared, but he had never imagined finding it in a homeless child who had broken into his office. Her approach to problem-solving was unlike anything he had encountered in decades of business negotiations and technical challenges. "Where did you learn to think like this?" he asked, genuine curiosity replacing his earlier amusement. Harper paused for a moment, her hands still moving across the controls, but her attention briefly shifting to the question. "Foster care," she said simply. "When you're passed between families who don't want you, you learn to read situations quickly. You learn to find solutions that work for everyone involved because if you don't, you end up back in the system." The honesty of her answer cut through the tension in the room. Here was a child who had been failed by every support system designed to protect her, yet she had developed problem-solving skills that surpassed those of highly educated professionals. The irony wasn't lost on any of the adults present. As for the families who had you, Ferd found himself asking, did they recognize your abilities? A shadow crossed Harper's young face. Most people see what they expect to see. A poor kid, a problem to be solved or ignored. The adults exchanged glances, recognizing that they were no longer dealing with a homeless child who had solved a technical problem, but with an emerging leader who understood both systemic failure and transformational possibility. The next hour would determine whether this moment became just an interesting story or the beginning of something that could reshape how society recognized and developed human potential. The next hour transformed Ferd's office from a crisis management center into an impromptu war room for social change. Harper had accepted the offer, but with conditions that revealed her understanding of both opportunity and responsibility went far deeper than anyone had imagined. She wasn't just thinking about her own future, she was architecting a systematic approach to discovering and developing overlooked intelligence. "I want the foundation structured so that traditional academic credentials aren't requirements for leadership positions," Harper explained as Ferd's legal team joined the discussion via video conference. "Some of the smartest people I've met never finished high school, but they understand systems and human behavior in ways that PhD programs don't teach." The lawyers exchanged glances that Harper caught immediately. She had learned to read adult expressions during her time in foster care, the subtle signals that indicated when people were humoring a child rather than taking them seriously. "I know what you're thinking," she said directly to the lead attorney on the screen. "A 10-year-old wanting to hire people without degrees sounds naive. But consider this. I just solved a problem that stumped 5 experts with advanced degrees and expensive equipment. Maybe the issue isn't my understanding of qualifications, but your definition of them." The lawyer, Marcus Brennan from Ferd's primary legal firm, paused his note-taking. "That's actually a fair. Okay, I understand the task." Harper met his gaze steadily, her small hands already gravitating toward the safe's control panel.
"Deal."
The atmosphere in the room underwent a dramatic shift, morphing from amusement to an uncomfortable silence as Harper approached the imposing safe. Marcus instinctively stepped forward, his protective instincts kicking in despite the sheer ridiculousness of the situation. "Sir, we really shouldn't let a child near equipment worth." "Let her try," Ferd interrupted, settling back into his leather chair with the air of someone about to witness an intriguing performance. What's the worst that could happen? She breaks something that's already broken. Harper disregarded the adult's conversation, her entire focus narrowing to the electronic display panel before her. Up close, she could discern details that the technicians had missed, subtle patterns in the error codes, the way certain LED indicators flickered in specific sequences, the almost imperceptible humming of processors working overtime to maintain security protocols. Her mind, honed by years of necessity to process information rapidly and identify solutions others overlooked, began to perceive the problem through a different lens than the experts had. Where they perceived a sophisticated security system, she saw an intricate electronic puzzle governed by logical patterns and predictable responses. The quantum encryption isn't the real problem, she murmured, more to herself than to the observing adults. It's a red herring. The system is designed to make you think that's where the failure is occurring. Dr. Chen leaned forward despite himself. What do you mean? Harper's small fingers traced patterns in the air above the display panel, careful not to make contact with anything just yet. See how these error codes are cycling? They're not random. There's a pattern. Every 47 seconds, the sequence repeats. That's not an encryption failure. That's a memory buffer overflow in the authentication subroutine. They don't look for intelligence in places where they don't expect to find it. Her words carried no self-pity, just the matter-of-fact assessment of someone who had learned to navigate a world that consistently undervalued her. But there was something else in her voice, a quiet determination that suggested her experiences had strengthened rather than broken her. The safe systems reached a critical point. Warning messages flooded the display faster than the human eye could read them. Emergency protocols and security protocols were now in direct, irreconcilable conflict, creating a digital stalemate that the safe's programming couldn't resolve through normal means. This is it, Harper announced, her small hands positioned over a final sequence of commands. In about 30 seconds, the system is going to face a choice: maintain security protocols and risk complete data loss, or prioritize data preservation and, temporarily, suspend security measures. She looked up at Ferd, her blue eyes reflecting a maturity that seemed impossible for someone her age. But I need you to understand something. If this works, I didn't just get lucky or stumble onto the solution. I earned it. Every night sleeping in doorways, every day figuring out how to survive, every hour spent in libraries teaching myself things that schools never had time to show me. All of that brought me to this moment. Ferd nodded slowly, beginning to understand that he was witnessing something far more significant than a technical solution to a mechanical problem. This was a demonstration of human potential that had been ignored, dismissed, and nearly lost to a system that failed to recognize talent outside of traditional boundaries. I understand, he said quietly. And I want you to know that regardless of what happens in the next few minutes, you've already proven something important today. Harper smiled, the first genuine expression of happiness she had shown since entering the office. Here's the interpreted and slightly expanded translation of the provided text into American English. Point. What alternative qualifications would you suggest? How about demonstrated problem-solving skills, evidence of innovative thinking when resources are limited, experience working with populations underserved by traditional social programs, and most importantly, a genuine commitment to recognizing intelligence in unexpected places rather than simply reinforcing existing power structures? Dr. Chen, who had remained in the office, quietly taking in everything that had been said, found himself scribbling notes. You're essentially proposing a meritocracy, he observed, one based on tangible results rather than formal credentials. That's genuinely brilliant, although implementing it in the real world would be exceptionally challenging. Anything truly worthwhile is challenging, Harper countered. If it were easy, someone would have already done it. Ferd watched this exchange with growing astonishment. In just a few short hours, Harper had not only displayed technical expertise that surpassed trained specialists, but was now articulating sophisticated organizational theories that challenged fundamental assumptions about how institutions should function. Her first-hand experience with systemic failures had provided her with insights that traditional education simply couldn't offer. Let's move on to the pilot program you mentioned, he suggested. How would you actually identify these overlooked kids? Harper's face lit up with enthusiasm, the first sign of excitement she had shown since entering the office. A street outreach program, but not the traditional kind. Instead of merely offering services, we'd be actively looking for specific indicators of intelligence that are typically overlooked. The silence in the room grew even more profound. Even Ferd found himself leaning forward, his amusement gradually giving way to genuine curiosity. How could a homeless child possibly grasp concepts that his highly paid experts were struggling to comprehend? You're saying the lock mechanism isn't actually broken? Marcus asked, his professional pride battling with burgeoning amazement.
Right.
The safe is doing exactly what it's supposed to do, protecting against intrusion. But someone changed something in the access protocols recently, didn't they? Harper turned to look directly at Ferd. You upgraded something, maybe added new biometric scanners, updated the software. Ferd's eyes widened in surprise. 3 days prior, his security team had installed new retinal scanners as part of a company-wide security upgrade. How could this child possibly know that? The new biometric system is trying to integrate with the old quantum encryption, but they're running on different temporal frameworks, Harper continued, her voice growing in confidence as the solution took shape in her mind. Every time you try to authenticate, the new system sends verification requests faster than the old system can process them. So, the old system locks down to protect against what it perceives as a brute force attack. The room remained eerily silent, save for the gentle hum of the air conditioning and the distant sounds of Manhattan traffic 42 floors below. Dr. Chen's face had turned pale, and Marcus was staring at Harper as if she had just spoken in an alien language that somehow made perfect sense. That's, Dr. Chen whispered, that's actually brilliant and completely correct. The temporal mismatch between authentication protocols would create exactly this kind of cascading failure. Harper nodded, her attention already turning to potential solutions. So, you don't need to break the encryption or override the lock. You just need to synchronize the two systems. Then she turned back to the control panel and executed the final sequence of commands that would determine whether her theory was brilliant insight or catastrophic error. The safe's displays went dark. Every warning light, every diagnostic indicator, every electronic sound ceased simultaneously. For a moment that felt like an eternity, the massive vault sat in complete silence, its fate hanging in the balance of programming logic that no human had ever tested under these conditions. Then, with a soft electronic chime that sounded almost musical in the sudden quiet, the safe's massive door clicked open. The soft click of the safe door opening echoed through the office like a gunshot in the absolute silence that followed. For several heartbeats, nobody moved. The adults stared at the slightly ajar door as if it might be a mirage, while Harper stood perfectly still, her small chest rising and falling with the controlled breathing of someone who had just accomplished the impossible. Then reality crashed back into the room with explosive force. Holy shit, Marcus whispered, forgetting his professional demeanor entirely. She actually did it. A 10-year-old just solved a problem that 5 experts couldn't crack in 3 hours. Dr. Chen was already moving toward the safe, his scientific mind demanding verification of what his eyes had witnessed. The door is completely unlocked. All security protocols have been suspended. The system has entered full preservation mode, granting unrestricted access to prevent potential data loss. Ferd remained seated, his dark eyes fixed on Harper with an expression that had evolved from amusement through skepticism to something approaching awe. The child stood before his open vault like David before Goliath's fallen form, small, unlikely, victorious against impossible odds. The documents, he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of $3 billion in implications. Are they intact? She walked over to the whiteboard that dominated one wall of Ferd's office, grabbed a marker, and began sketching out her ideas with the confidence of someone who had been grappling with these issues for years. Kids who figured out how to access free Wi-Fi in restricted areas. Kids who've developed elaborate systems for evading detection by authority figures. Kids who possess the social intelligence to navigate complex family dynamics or street hierarchies. Kids who've taught themselves valuable skills through trial and error because formal education was either unavailable or ineffective for them. Her diagrams, while simple, were remarkably clear, illustrating interconnected systems that accounted for different types of intelligence and various pathways for development. The adults in the room realized they were witnessing a level of strategic thinking that most graduate students would struggle to achieve. The key, Harper continued, is understanding that intelligence adapts to circumstances. A kid who's a survival expert might struggle with traditional academic tasks, not because they lack intellectual capacity, but because their intelligence has been focused on more immediate needs. Marcus from the legal team spoke up again. This approach would require substantial resources for outreach and assessment. Have you considered the logistics? Constantly, Harper replied without hesitation. That's why the foundation needs to be large enough to fund impactful, long-term programs, not just superficial initiatives. We're talking about systemic change, which demands systematic resources. She turned back to the whiteboard, adding numbers and budget estimates that demonstrated her deep understanding of the financial implications of her vision. Initial outreach teams for 5 major cities. Specialized assessment tools designed by experts in non-traditional intelligence. Mentorship programs pairing these kids with adults who have overcome similar challenges. But she paused, studying the display more intently. The manual controls aren't designed for that kind of adjustment. You need to access the root programming, which requires administrative access that we don't have, Marcus finished, his voice heavy with defeat. The manufacturer's backdoor codes expired last month, and we can't get new ones until... You don't need backdoor codes, Harper interrupted. You need to think like the system. What would make it voluntarily reset its own temporal framework? She began to move around the safe, examining it from different angles. Her small stature allowed her to spot details at levels the adults couldn't easily reach, cable connections near the floor, ventilation patterns that might indicate the placement of internal components, tiny indicator lights that were barely visible from a standing position. Emergency protocols, she murmured, crouching down to examine a small panel near the base of the safe. Every system has them. Something that would make it prioritize access over security in a life-threatening situation. Faird found himself genuinely impressed despite his inherent skepticism. And you think you can trigger these emergency protocols? Harper looked up at him, her young face serious. Maybe, but I need to understand something first. What's actually in this safe that's so important? You need it opened in the next. She glanced at the wall clock. 2 hours and 15 minutes. The question caught Faird off guard. He had become so consumed by the technical challenge that he had momentarily forgotten about the merger deadline that had precipitated this crisis. Legal documents, he admitted, contracts for a business deal that needs to be signed today, or my company loses a $3 billion acquisition opportunity. Harper nodded thoughtfully. So this isn't just about proving a point or showing off. There are real consequences if this doesn't work. Very real consequences. One of the technicians carefully opened the safe door fully, revealing the pristine interior with its organized shelves of legal files, contracts, and sensitive business documents. Everything was exactly as it had been when the lock first malfunctioned, preserved in climate-controlled perfection. Everything appears undamaged, the technician reported. The preservation protocols worked exactly as intended. Faird stood slowly, his movements deliberate as he processed the magnitude of what had just occurred. A homeless child had not only saved his business deal but had demonstrated a level of technical understanding that challenged everything he thought he knew about intelligence, education, and human potential. $100 million, he said, the words hanging in the air like a promise that everyone had forgotten was real until this moment. Harper turned to face him, her expression serious despite her youth. I assumed you were joking when you said that. I was, Faird admitted. But I'm not joking now. The room fell silent again as the implications sank in. $100 million was more money than most people could comprehend, let alone a homeless child who had been surviving on scraps and sleeping in doorways. It was enough money to transform not just Harper's life, but the lives of thousands of others. But Harper didn't react with excitement or disbelief. Instead, she studied Faird's face with the same analytical intensity she had applied to the safe's electronic systems. Why? She asked simply. The question caught everyone off guard. Dr. Chun and Marcus exchanged glances, clearly expecting the child to be overwhelmed with gratitude or excitement. Instead, she was interrogating the offer with the skepticism of someone who had learned not to trust promises from adults. "Because you earned it," Ferd replied, "and educational resources that adapt to different learning styles and life circumstances." Ferd was deeply impressed, not only by Harper's vision but also by her practical understanding of the challenges involved in implementation. "You've thought about this in remarkable detail, especially considering you only learned about the available resources an hour ago." "I've been thinking about solutions to these problems my whole life," Harper said simply. "I just never had the resources to bring them to fruition." Dr. Chen looked up from his notes. "What about resistance?" "Systems resist change, and there will be individuals who benefit from the current structure and who won't appreciate your approach." Harper's expression grew serious. "Of course, there will be resistance. People who've built their careers on traditional gatekeeping won't want to admit that their methods have been overlooking talent. Institutions that profit from maintaining an artificial scarcity of opportunity won't welcome programs that democratize access to advancement." She paused, looking around the room at the adults who were taking her seriously, perhaps the first adults who ever had. "But that's precisely why this work is so essential. When systems consistently fail to recognize talent, the problem isn't with the talent itself, it's with the systems. And systems can be changed if you have enough resources and enough determination." The legal team had been working on contract language while Harper outlined her vision, and Marcus rejoined the discussion with preliminary terms. "We've structured the foundation as an independent entity with Harper as the sole decision-making authority, advised by a board she selects. The initial funding would be the full $100 million, with Mr. Alzera having no control over operations or strategic decisions." "What about accountability?" Harper asked. "How do we ensure the foundation actually accomplishes its mission instead of simply becoming another ineffective bureaucracy? Thousands of jobs, multiple companies, futures of investors who trust me to deliver on my promises." Ferd's voice carried the weight of genuine responsibility. "That's why I hired the best security specialists money could buy." Harper cast her gaze around the room, taking in the expensive equipment, the highly credentialed experts, the luxurious office whose furnishings alone cost more than most people earned in a lifetime. Then she looked down at her own tattered clothes, her bare feet, her empty stomach that hadn't tasted food in 2 days. "The best money can buy," she repeated quietly. "But sometimes, the best solutions don't come from money." She straightened up. "Decision made. Okay, I'm going to try something, but I need everyone to step back and let me work. No questions, no suggestions, no interruptions. These systems are designed to detect multiple user inputs as potential security threats." The adults exchanged glances. Allowing a homeless child to potentially damage millions of dollars worth of equipment went against every ingrained instinct, but they had exhausted all other options, and something about Harper's confident demeanor was beginning to convince them that she might actually know what she was doing. "If you break anything," Marcus began. "Then you'll be exactly where you are now," Harper finished, "locked out of your own safe with a deadline you can't meet. The only difference is, you'll have someone to blame who can't afford to pay you back." Ferd raised his hand to silence his team. "Do it." Harper approached the safe with the methodical precision of someone who had learned to solve problems through observation rather than formal training. The watching adults retreated as requested, forming a semicircle around her like spectators at a performance they didn't fully comprehend but couldn't tear themselves away from. "You solved a problem that threatened my company, saved a business deal worth billions, and demonstrated abilities that frankly shame the expensive consultants I usually rely on." Harper shook her head slightly. "Those are business reasons. You're a businessman. You understand return on investment, cost-benefit analysis, strategic value. Paying me $100 million for a few minutes of work doesn't make business sense, no matter how valuable the outcome." Her insight was uncomfortably accurate. Ferd had become successful by making calculated decisions based on clear strategic thinking, not emotional gestures or impulsive generosity. The child's ability to see through his motives to the underlying questions was as impressive as her technical skills had been. "You're right," he acknowledged. "So, Let me give you a different answer. I'm offering you this money because I see potential that has been wasted by every system designed to nurture it. You're brilliant, resourceful, and capable of things that people twice your age with expensive educations couldn't accomplish. But more than that, you represent something I had forgotten about, which is that sometimes the most valuable solutions come from the places we least expect to find them. Ferd moved closer to the window, gazing down at the Manhattan streets where Harper had been surviving just hours earlier. I built my fortune by identifying undervalued assets and investing in their potential. You're the most undervalued asset I've ever encountered. Harper followed his gaze to the window, looking down at the world she knew intimately, a world of cold doorways, empty stomachs, and people who looked through her as if she didn't exist. And what do you expect in return? She asked, her voice carrying the weariness of someone who had learned that every offer came with strings attached. Nothing, Ferd said, surprising himself with the honesty of his answer. This isn't an investment with expected returns. The question revealed yet another layer of her sophisticated thinking. She wasn't just focused on acquiring resources. She was also considering how to prevent those resources from being wasted or misused over time. Performance metrics, Ferd suggested, measurable outcomes that demonstrate real impact rather than just good intentions. Exactly. And regular assessments conducted by the communities we're trying to serve, not just by academic or philanthropic institutions. Harper was clearly thinking through every aspect of maintaining integrity and effectiveness over the long term. As the afternoon progressed, the scope of their plans became clear. This wasn't merely a generous gift to a deserving child. It was the launch of a systematic challenge to how society identifies, develops, and supports human potential. Harper's unique combination of personal experience, analytical intelligence, and strategic thinking was creating something truly unprecedented. There's one more thing, Harper said as the contract discussions neared completion. I want part of the Foundation's work to include comprehensive documentation and research. We need to prove that our approach works, and we need to share what we learn so that other organizations can replicate and improve upon our methods. Academic publications, Dr. Chen asked, among other things, but also accessible communication that reaches people who don't typically read academic journals, the kids we're trying to help, their families, the community organizations that support them. They need to understand that intelligence takes many forms and that their experiences matter. The sun was setting over Manhattan, casting long shadows across Ferd's office as they finalized the details that would transform Harper from a homeless child into one of the youngest philanthropic leaders in history. But more than that, they were creating a foundation that could prove intelligence wasn't a rare commodity confined to privileged circumstances. Her small hands hovered over the control panel with surprising confidence, not touching anything yet, but studying the layout with the intensity of a chess grandmaster, plotting multiple moves in advance. The LED display continued its rhythmic cycling of error codes, each repetition serving as a reminder of the expensive failure unfolding around her. The emergency protocols I mentioned, she said quietly, her voice barely audible over the safe's electronic hum. They're not documented in the user manuals. Manufacturers build them in for liability reasons, but they don't advertise them because it would compromise security. Dr. Chin found himself leaning forward, fighting against his professional skepticism. How could you possibly know about undocumented features? Harper's lips curved into the faintest of smiles, the first genuine emotion she had displayed since entering the room. When you're homeless, you learn to find hidden things, food behind restaurants, warm places to sleep, electrical outlets that aren't supposed to be accessible. Electronic systems are just another environment to navigate. She began to work, her movements deliberate and measured. It's recognition of value that already exists but has been ignored. The other adults in the room listened to this exchange with growing amazement. They were witnessing something unprecedented, not just a business transaction, but a moment of recognition between two minds that operated on levels most people never reached. I don't think you understand what you're offering, Harper said quietly. $100 million isn't just money. It's power, influence, the ability to change systems instead of just surviving them. Are you really prepared to give that to a homeless kid? The question revealed depths of understanding that went far beyond her years. Harper wasn't just thinking about personal benefit. She was considering the broader implications of sudden enormous wealth. She understood that money wasn't just purchasing power, but social influence, political leverage, and the ability to reshape the very systems that had failed her. Ferd studied her carefully. In the space of a few hours, this remarkable child had challenged every assumption he held about intelligence, potential, and social value. Now, she was demonstrating a level of wisdom about power and responsibility that many adults never achieved. Maybe that's exactly what the world needs, he said thoughtfully. It was a human capacity that thrived everywhere, waiting only for recognition and opportunity. Are you ready for this responsibility? Ferd asked as they prepared to sign the final documents. Harper looked out at the city lights beginning to twinkle in the growing darkness, knowing that somewhere among those lights were thousands of children like her, brilliant, resourceful, and invisible to systems that didn't know how to see them. I've been ready my whole life, she said quietly. I just didn't know it until today. 6 months after that transformative day in Ferd's office, Harper stood before a packed auditorium at Columbia University, preparing to deliver the keynote address at the National Conference on Educational Innovation. The irony was not lost on her. A year ago, she had been sleeping in doorways and scavenging for food. Now, she was addressing some of the most influential educators and policymakers in the country. But this moment represented more than personal transformation. The Harper Foundation had already identified and supported 847 children with exceptional abilities in non-traditional circumstances. The pilot program had exceeded all expectations, discovering mathematical prodigies in juvenile detention centers, engineering geniuses in homeless shelters, and strategic thinkers in foster care systems across 5 major cities.